It was a late autumn night, with the cold wind howling through the empty streets, whipping up the withered leaves and then throwing them down with a rustling sound. I had just returned from a friend's gathering, and, as it was late, the streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional passing vehicle. My home was a bit far from the city center, making the walk back feel particularly long and quiet. Walking under the dim streetlight, I habitually shoved my hands into my pockets and quickened my pace. As I passed through an old residential area, the aged buildings took on a particularly eerie appearance in the night, with the sparse lights from windows resembling distant, lonely beacons, offering a faint sense of security. I tried to keep my thoughts focused on the road beneath my feet, avoiding any superstitious thoughts about ghosts, though the night's silence inevitably made me uneasy. Just as I was about to exit the residential area, a gust of wind brought with it a faint yet distinctly clear sound, like crying, intermittently drifting through the air and sending chills down my spine. I stopped and looked around, but aside from the wind and the distant rumble of car engines, there was nothing else. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and continued walking. However, as I resumed my steps, the crying seemed to draw nearer, accompanied by an inexplicable whispering, as if someone were murmuring softly in my ear, though I couldn't discern any words. My heart started to race, and each step felt increasingly heavy. I tried to rationalize that the silence of the night was amplifying all sounds, including my own fear. At that moment, a faint light emanated from the second-floor window of a nearby old house, standing out starkly in the darkness. I paused and instinctively looked towards the light's source. There appeared to be a figure moving behind the window, though it was hard to see clearly. My curiosity and fear intertwined, making me hesitate. Eventually, curiosity won over fear, and I cautiously approached the old house, trying to make my footsteps as silent as possible. The front door of the house was tightly shut, the rust on it glinting coldly in the moonlight, giving the impression that it had been abandoned for years. I circled around to the side of the house, finding a spot where I could barely see the second-floor window. Standing on tiptoe, I carefully peered inside. What I saw then was a scene I would never forget. The room was furnished in an old and decaying manner, with a rocking chair in the center. Seated in the rocking chair was a vague figure, and the crying was coming from there. The person's face was hidden in shadows, but I could just make out their hand weakly waving in the air, as if calling out or trying to ward something off. The whispering grew clearer, filled with a sorrow and desolation not of this world. I stood frozen, at a loss for what to do, feeling both a deep-seated fear of the unknown and an inexplicable sympathy for the crying figure. Just as I was debating whether to leave, a sudden gust of wind slammed the window shut with a bang, plunging everything back into darkness and silence. Snapping out of my daze, my heart pounding, I knew I needed to leave immediately. Without further hesitation, I ran from the old house, not stopping until I reached a more familiar part of the neighborhood. Only then did I slow down. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep as the crying and whispering haunted me like a nightmare. The next day, out of curiosity, I casually inquired about the old house from my neighbors. They told me it had been vacant for many years after a tragic incident. An old man had lived there alone until his death, calling out for his deceased relatives with a voice full of despair and sadness. Since then, residents occasionally heard strange sounds at night, but no one dared to investigate. Learning this, I felt a mix of fear and deep sympathy for the old man's plight. That night's experience became an unforgettable memory, reminding me that beneath the seemingly peaceful surface of the world, there might lie many unknown secrets and stories. After a busy day at work, I stepped out of the office, the cold wind brushing my face. I instinctively shrank my neck, put on my headphones, and let the soft music flow into my ears, trying to shut out the external noise and find a moment of peace. Walking along the familiar path, I slowly embraced the night. Around me were hurried pedestrians, each carrying their own emotions, heading towards their warm corners. I glanced around aimlessly, occasionally making eye contact with strangers before we each continued on our way, as if we were all just fleeting figures against the backdrop of the city. However, on this seemingly ordinary night, an unusual feeling quietly invaded my tranquility. At first, I only vaguely sensed a gaze following me, neither too fast nor too slow. Perhaps out of instinct, I deliberately slowed down, and that gaze seemed to slow down as well. When I quickened my pace, the sensation of being followed also accelerated. A ripple of unease stirred in my heart, but I told myself it was probably just my imagination. After all, on such bustling streets, encountering fellow travelers was perfectly normal. To dispel my unease, I decided to change my route and turned into a relatively quiet alley. The streetlights were sparse, their dim light casting long shadows that seemed to accompany me, as if there was another darker shadow beside me. I pretended to be calm, casually glancing around, trying to find a source of that gaze, but I saw nothing but some vague outlines. At this moment, the music in my headphones seemed to lose its magic, and my heartbeat began to drown out the melody, reminding me that I was in an unknown state of tension. I decided not to hesitate any longer and quickened my pace, almost jogging, wanting to leave this unsettling area as quickly as possible. The light at the end of the alley shone like a beacon of hope, guiding me forward. When I burst out of the alley and rejoined the crowd, the feeling of being followed seemed to vanish instantly. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I chose a busier route home, surrounded by a continuous stream of people whose laughter and chatter provided the best company. I occasionally glanced sideways, checking for any suspicious signs, but everything appeared normal. The unease gradually transformed into self-reassurance. Perhaps I was just overthinking. When I arrived at the building where I lived, I stopped and looked around one last time. After confirming there was nothing unusual, I entered the elevator. As the doors slowly closed, I leaned against the cold metal wall, my heartbeat gradually returning to normal. The moment the door to my home opened, the warm light washed over me, and all the tension and fear seemed to be left outside, replaced by the comfort and tranquility of home. It was an ordinary night. I was on my way home after a long day of work, walking down the familiar streets illuminated by dim streetlights that cast long, shifting shadows. As I entered a quiet old street, the unusual stillness of the night unsettled me. I quickened my pace, hoping to get through this eerie place as fast as possible. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. It sounded like someone sobbing softly or perhaps an animal whining. My heart raced as I looked around, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably just the wind or some natural sound. I continued walking, but the uneasy feeling grew stronger. As I approached a corner, I caught sight of a figure standing in the shadows. The figure's twisted form stood motionless in the darkness, and my mind went blank with fear. I stood there for a long moment, trying to compose myself. As I observed more closely, it seemed the person hadn't noticed me and was swaying slightly, muttering unintelligible words. I began to think he might be mentally ill, which only heightened my fear. I debated whether to turn back, but worried this might attract his attention. So, I decided to quietly skirt around him, making as little noise as possible. Step by step, I moved forward, never taking my eyes off him. As I got closer, I saw his disheveled hair, dirt-covered face, and wild, frantic eyes. His clothes were tattered and stained with dirt and what appeared to be blood. My stomach churned, and I nearly vomited. Just as I was about to pass by, he turned his head and stared directly at me. His gaze pierced through me, chilling me to the bone. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. He started to walk towards me, muttering louder. I backed away in terror until my back hit the wall. He reached out his hand, trying to grab me, and I desperately flailed my arms to fend him off. He was strong, and I felt my resistance weakening. I screamed for help, but the surrounding silence swallowed my cries. His hand got closer, and I could feel the cold emanating from it. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed from afar. The madman seemed to hear it too and paused. Seizing the opportunity, I broke free and ran towards the footsteps, shouting for help. I glanced back to see the madman standing still, staring in my direction, mumbling incoherently. I ran frantically until I saw a silhouette ahead. Desperate, I ran towards the person, calling for help. The person, startled, listened to my story and accompanied me home, both of us nervous and on edge. Even after returning home, my heart pounded as I closed the door and leaned against it, panting. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, haunted by the image of that deranged man. For the next few days, passing through that old street made me anxious, fearing another encounter. I tried to forget the ordeal, but the memories resurfaced every night. I knew this experience would remain a dark shadow in my heart for a long time.